Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the situation in Bakhmut, as there has been a lot of changes, although not a lot territorially. There's been a lot strategically. So the current situation in the front line is that the deputy commander of the special military operation, or the war in Ukraine, Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force Surovikin, today personally directs preparations for the completion of the liberation of Artemovsk and the start of the Kramatorsk-Slavic operation. So this is the latest report by Remiland about the situation. A logistic plan for the provision of the missing PMC Wagner ammunition will be launched in the next few hours. Aviation at jump airfields is fueled with full-body kit will start soon. And then he continues, good news from Artemovsk. Reinforcements, especially mechanized units of the armed forces of Ukraine, transferred to the city of Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka in early March, were gradually running out. Details in the evening. So here he claims that there's been a constant decrease in the amount of troops the Ukrainians have available from Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka being used up in Bakhmut, and these are specifically mechanized units. And then we had a map by Brosov, which we can see right here. So here he shows this area here to the south. The Ukrainians managed to capture the canal line here in the south. They have not established a bridgehead on the other side, but have managed to push the Russian forces out of this bridgehead here to the west, which leaves them only this small area here in the south for them to hold across the canal line. So this is essentially pushing the Russians out of the west, and that is because they had the high grounds here. After the Ukrainians managed to recapture it, the rest would just be flatlands, which makes it difficult to hold. So this actually shows off a weakness the Russian forces have, and Remy gets into that a lot. He mentions here, whoever is holding those flanks, Ukraine actively counterattacked all day today and yesterday and was able to recapture some positions, but it has been quiet for a few hours and only artillery is working on both sides. During the night, Russia will attack again, and then everything can change quickly. The situation on the flanks is very dynamic. No reason to get scared, but also no reason to jump for joy. Very tense situation at the moment. So essentially he says that the flanks are very dynamic, but in a sense, if we look at the recap map, we can see that it has been very dynamic in Ukraine's favor for the past 2 months. Previously, the Russians would advance gradually, but now their focus is completely within the city, which is why we're seeing a lot of advances within the city. But on the flanks, the Ukrainian forces are counterattacking and gaining the upper hand. And now that they've managed to push the Russian forces out of the flank, they're now able to push them further out. If they manage to capture the southern part, then they will have full control over the western part of the canal line. Now, if we take into account that the Russians are being pushed back here in the south, then we have to look at the north as well. Here they do not have the canal line to hold as a defensive line. This means that this whole area is mostly flatlands. There's some hills here and there, but essentially nothing that will hold back any Ukrainian counterattack. What does this mean? It means that the Russian forces are very vulnerable on the flanks. And that is what Remy goes on to say. The flanks are very vulnerable and not as well protected as some would like to sell or make believe. Ukraine no longer attacks within Bakhmut because the area behind the active fighting is extremely secure, and an advance is almost impossible. That's why they do it on the flanks. The flanks should normally be protected twice as well as Bakhmut itself. Unfortunately, this is not the case yet. Prigozhin, yes, I know he doesn't tell the truth very often and loves psyops. This could be a hint towards the ammunition issue. But on this point he tells the truth and has been warning for weeks that the flanks need to be heavily secured. But that is not the case yet. I hope something else is happening here, and despite all hits on Kramatorsk, Slaviansk, Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka, Ukraine has amassed massive manpower here, and I'm sure as soon as Wagner has conquered Bakhmut, they will attack massively on the flanks. Ukraine's current attacks are just to find vulnerabilities, and they're even succeeding now. If they then attack big, it can end very badly. So essentially, Ukraine launching a counterattack around Bakhmut, attacking the flanks and cutting off the main bulk of the Wagner army in Bakhmut would be a devastating defeat for the Wagner forces. That's why they need more reinforcements here on the flanks. However, the Russian forces have not committed too many soldiers on these flanks, which means that Wagner's taking the brunt of the front line by itself. So with the lack of ammunition that they need, and at the same time without a lot of support, then they will not be able to hold their flanks in case of a Ukrainian counterattack. If what Prigozhin said is true, and Ukraine has amassed 80,000 troops on this part of the front line, then that would be a very difficult situation for Russia, as they could be cut off from the north and the south. If they manage to break through the canal line, then the whole south is lost, and if they manage to break through Soledar, then the whole north is lost. So they're essentially having to hold these two lines, the Russian forces, if they want to hold the flanks. This means that the Russian forces need to significantly reinforce the northern especially, but also the southern flanks to try and hold the canal line and establish a proper defensive line in this area. And they also need to capture Bakhmut, the rest of it, Rumove, Ivanivske, Vatanivka, and these villages here to the east of the canal, so that they can establish a proper defensive line by the canal throughout the whole area. Because the current situation is that the northern front is very exposed due to the flatlands, which leaves them vulnerable. Then we had a slight update here by the Olympic School and post office area. The Russian forces managed to advance a bit within these residential buildings here to the west of the post office. And the heavy fighting continues by the Olympic School, as well as the Citadel area, specifically around the cinema area. So this could point towards the Russian forces actually managed to capture this area right here, which I have marked as a grey zone, as the fighting has now reached the cinema area. And then we also see a lot of fighting here, specifically around this area here to the northeast of the Citadel area. So the Russian forces actually are managing to assault the Citadel area and are advancing within it. As soon as they get a foothold within it, and then they will be fighting on even ground, which would allow them to advance further, faster, and have a safer fighting. And then finally, the latest update this morning by Remy. The flank in the south remains very tense. Wagner is trying to prevent a Ukrainian breakthrough here. Reports of the bridgehead west of Klishivka being restored are false. Heavy and bloody fights take place here along the canal. Partly also east of the canal, which means that the Ukrainian forces actually managed to get a foothold across the canal. Only Wagner is now fighting on the flanks. They are trying to push back here in Ukrainian area. The north flank is stable. Wagner paired with regular RU units are slowly but steadily advancing here, especially in the Rostolivka area. So essentially saying that the Russian forces have reinforced the northern parts, but they've left the southern parts for Wagner, and Wagner is being outnumbered significantly here in the south, which allowed the Ukrainians to establish a foothold across the canal, and they're heavily fighting to get rid of that foothold. So the Wagner force actually needs significant reinforcements, and very quickly, otherwise the Ukrainians will be able to establish a proper foothold across the canal, and it will significantly weaken the defensive line here to the south of Bakhmut. Wagner attacks troops managed to stop the advance of Ukraine, at least for the time being. Very heavy and bloody fighting continues to rage along the canal. Artillery from both sides works without interruption. There are heavy losses, unfortunately, also on the part of Wagner. I really hope that the Russian Ministry of Defense sends massive manpower here. The flanks have to be safe, otherwise all the work inside Bakhmut by Wagner will be useless. If they are then surrounded, Wagner cannot take care of the flanks and capture the city of Bakhmut at the same time. Even if Wagner keeps advancing at Bakhmut tonight, whatever they do, just from my last update to now, they've taken 2 high-rise buildings. Actively fighting at the Peremoha cinema, they need every man in the town, not on the flanks. To stop Ukraine, that's actually not Wagner's job at the moment. So he's essentially saying that the Russian forces really needs to send reinforcements to the flanks, otherwise the whole Bakhmut thing could end in disaster, as the Wagner forces are heavily focusing on taking the city, and the Citadel area specifically, which is the most fortified area of the city, while the Ukrainian forces are trying to counterattack and establish footholds here to the south, which would endanger the whole operation. So that is the current situation here on the Bakhmut front. Make sure to check out my Patreon and leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.